No to racism. Following the killing of George Floyd at the hands of the police in Minneapolis, there have been weeks of demonstrations in the US against racist violence. And the Black Lives Matter movement has inspired hundreds of thousands of people to take to the streets across Europe too. The protests have triggered a new debate here in Germany on everyday racism, which figures show is on the rise and which has a long and troubling history. So our question on To The Point, racism, how to heal the hurt. Welcome to this week's show, where we're going to try and cast some constructive light on the racism and discrimination that are apparently rooted in our societies. I'm Peter Craven, and these are my guests. Emilia Roig, French by birth, she is the founder and executive director of the Centre for Intersectional Justice. That's a Berlin-based organisation combating all forms of inequality and discrimination in Europe. Now, she says as long as there is racism in Germany, the word race must not be removed from the constitution, as some are proposing. Also with us is Brandon Keith Brown. He's a classical music conductor working with renowned orchestras here in Germany, who believes it's important to speak his mind on issues like race and exclusion. And Brandon says reflection on racism is only tolerated when people of colour are murdered. And a very warm welcome too to Mohamed Amjahid, an author and journalist with the German weekly Die Zeit, who says, here in Germany too, we must have no inhibitions in addressing problems of structural racism and above all, police discrimination and brutality. Thank you all three for being here. Emilia, I would like to begin with you. Something big is clearly happening. Hundreds of thousands of people taking to the streets in Europe and the US. We've seen it all before. Are you confident, are you hopeful that this time something more might come of it?
Well, what I think is that what is different from before is that there seems to be a collective epiphany on the fact that racism is real, and that it has really deep roots in our societies, not only in the US, but also in Europe, in Germany, France, Belgium, Spain, Italy. And in that regard, I feel like there's a readiness to have open conversations about it. And for example, such a set I don't think it would have been thinkable 5, 6, 7 years ago. And so that's why I'm hopeful, yes, and hope is different from optimism. It means that I have hope that things will evolve in the right direction. It doesn't mean that there are concrete and material signs that show me that it's the case currently. But what I see is that the fact that in the mainstream, we're speaking about structural systemic racism, that we are speaking about police brutality, and also putting in question the legitimacy of an institution like the police is giving me hope. OK, well, tell me this. Your organisation, we just had the name of the organisation, the Centre for Intersectional Justice, and it aims to combat all forms of inequality and discrimination in Europe. The question is how? So how? I mean, we have a strategy that is very holistic, and we don't tackle the problem for just one angle. First of all, from multiple axes. So when we say equality and justice for all, we mean, or more like liberation and equality, liberation and justice for all. We are not looking at discrimination from single axis, like it's been the case, just on the axis of gender or sexual orientation or class or race. But we're looking at the intricate relationship that exists between all those systems of oppression, but also all these discrimination dimensions. And then second, we do this through advocacy in the widest sense. So it includes, of course, direct classical advocacy with policymakers at government level, parliament level. We work closely with the European Commission and the European Parliament, but also from the bottom up, meaning working with civil society and trying to amplify a movement through a change of narrative, a change of discourse when we speak about discrimination. OK, Mohamed, you have written about everyday racism that people of colour are confronted with in majority white cultures. What have you learned?
It's a fight. It's not easy, because I can see right now in Germany a discussion where a lot of Germans, white Germans especially, they say, oh, racism and police brutality, that's something in the US. We don't have that in Europe. We have right now the Minister of Interior Affairs, who is putting pressure on a journalist who wrote a text about police brutality, threatening to sue her. And that shows how white supremacy is trying really to stop this conversation. At the same time, we cannot do that anymore because we are here and we are loud.
One example you have just given of discrimination here in Germany. Is your overall sense that you are living in a society that is moving forward or moving backwards?
I think it's more visible. It's not about forward or backwards. What happened to George Floyd, the lynching, we just saw it on video. That was happening the whole time. And now people are starting to take pictures, to tell their stories, to have the opportunity to write books in the mainstream media, for example. That's the difference. And I don't think that I can at least say, oh, it's getting better or it's getting worse, from my perspective.
So there's a readiness that you talked about, and there are people, the people of colour community, if you so will, is getting a higher profile in Germany as a result of a new level of consciousness?
I mean, also, people of color, you have black stories. You have, in Germany, a lot of Germans from Turkish descent or Arab descent, for example. The consciousness comes because there are more and more voices that now they can speak. And having said that, there are more and more other voices trying to stop those people to tell their own story and to change something in institutions, how the society thinks about stuff, and also talking about resources, who can talk about what and how.
Brandon, you're a classical music conductor, we made the point already. At the same time, you are somebody who is driven to get a message across. You are vociferous in your protest about the world you see around you. Tell me more. Why are you so vociferous?
Well, classical music is the only genre really that divides society by race and class in such an extreme way. And what we're finding out during COVID is that whites playing whites for whites isn't working for the genres who sustain the genre. And what I believe, if you want to change the racial conscience of people, you have to affect their spirit. Laws and politics, of course, is not going to change the minds and racial conscience of people. So what we need to do is to force people to develop empathy. And I believe you can do that through sound. Getting people together of different walks of life, different nationalities, different religions, different colors, different races together, and to share empathy through sound. This is a type of empathy that will go into the pausa, that will go into the streets. And this is something that you can't emulate through any other aspect of society.
And you've been here in Germany, you've been doing that for 4 years. What's the difference between American society, the American society that you have lived in, and the German society that you do live in? What would you like to communicate to our audience about those two?
On the surface, African Americans typically say, at least they don't shoot us here, very often. They don't shoot us too often here. It still happens quite a lot, and it's not covered in the media in Germany. So on a surface level, there's not this, perpetual fear of being shot by the police. But at the same time, the racism is more insidious and more backed by the government. The fact there's no racial census here. So the government of Germany basically says that racism doesn't exist. And if you're not counted, you don't count.
The government of Germany does not say that racism does not exist.
You don't feel that.
No, I think what they say, if I may, I think what Germany is saying is that racism is an individual, interpersonal phenomenon, and that is not rooted in institutions and in the system. So there's a lack of recognition of the existence of systemic institutional racism, and racism, individual racism, is mostly pushed to certain groups like neo-Nazis, like bad people who are intentionally racist.
Because we don't have this empirical data, it's very difficult to justify everyday racism. It's very difficult. In the United States, we have this empirical data. In the UK, you have this data on police brutality, racial profiling. It's very difficult to find out about discrimination in healthcare here. All of these things are going on.
My sense is that is changing, that the more information, more statistics, more figures are being gathered, and that the battle... Well, tell me.
No, it's not, actually.
There's, if I may... There are few studies, for example, about police brutality in Germany against black people and people of color. I worked for years on this topic, and there is one only one study really showing how big the problem is. So I also see
But the thing, this should be government-backed. Government should investigate incidences of racism. In America, it's very complicated, but the state and federal government investigate when you go to the cafe and they kick you out. They do it for free. Here in Germany, you have to pay a lawyer.
Sure.
The lawyer has white fragility. The judge doesn't want to deal with this either. They also have the same racial conscience of white Germans who are racist. You can't count on the government to help people who are victims of racism in Germany.
I can remember Germany 20 years ago. It was a very, very, very different country. It was ethnic in large measure. It was monocultural in large measure. From my perspective, it was the question we had just now, whether this is, society has changed, whether it's moving forward or backward. My sense is that Germany has made huge steps forward.
Well, just one more thing. The sociologist Michel Lamont and many sociologists, internationally, when society becomes globalized, the more inequality is created, the more separation we have. It's like oil and vinegar. People don't all hold hands and kiss. When the wall came down, the East and West did not all hold hands and kiss. It's still fairly separate. When the refugees came, the German people, all of them didn't just welcome them into their neighborhoods. We still have pictures on the resume. If you have wearing a hijab, you're not going to be invited. You're not likely to be invited for that job. Why are pictures on the resume? We're still looking at the way people look, how imitation white German can you become to have access to society? I'm sorry, I don't know if it's really changed that much.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and also when you say that 20 years ago, Germany was very mono-ethnic and monocultural, I don't think it was the case. It's just that people were invisibilized. They were, the generation of so-called guest workers and their descendants, their children and grandchildren, who did live here, but they were recluded in certain areas and did not have access to public discourse. They did not have access to visibility in the public space. And this is maybe what has changed a little bit. I wouldn't even go as far as saying that it has really tremendously changed, but what has brought awareness as well is that more and more people coming from other countries, people of color coming from France, from Belgium, from the US, are making their way to Germany and also exposing those issues. But we haven't really gone beyond the exposure, and this is only right now happening. That racism has come forward. I'm not really sure, but maybe.
But also, it depends.
You have been so patient, but I'll bring you in next. We need to just move.
No, go ahead. It's your show.
Okay. The long and the very toxic debate on the impact of race has also recently manifested itself here in Germany, in Europe, in the US as well, in a global wave of protest actions against monuments, statues and other artefacts, celebrating and even glorifying racism and colonialism. They've been toppled. Let's get a quick feel for what that's all about, and we'll talk about that too.
There he lies, Christopher Columbus. This statue in the U.S. state of Minnesota stood for one of the most important people in world history, the man known as the discoverer of America. But for many people, especially those in Latin America, his name represents the beginning of a period of great suffering marked by the oppression and exploitation of the indigenous population. The discussion over monuments commemorating the colonial era has been reignited in Europe as well, including here in the English city of Bristol. Edward Colston is remembered as a philanthropist by some and as a slave trader by others. The bronze monument has now been yanked from its pedestal and shoved into the harbor by protesters. Across Belgium, numerous statues of King Leopold II have been covered with paint or pulled down to protest the monarch's reign of terror in the Congo. And in Germany, there have also been demands for years now to rename monuments and streets that pay homage to Germany's colonial past. To uphold or to tear down, do we need to rethink our culture of remembrance?
Well, that's one big, important question. First of all, I'd like to go right back to Mohamed. I was very rude. I cut you off there. Can you build a bridge from what we've just been listening to where you were and the point you wanted to make?
I'll try. It also depends where you are, if you can see how homogeneous the German society is. Where the decisions are made, that's a very wide space, usually in journalism, in politics, in civil society. And the discussion also is for example, what happens right now in Berlin with the anti-discrimination law, which is talking about police brutality. You have a lot of powerful...
The first law of its kind in Germany.
When I talk to my friends from the US, for example, they are like, you don't have an anti-discrimination law? Like, I'm like, yes, we do not have. And a lot of older white men in this case, I'm sorry,
I've got to take it.
are trying to say, we don't need this law, this is discrimination against police. And that's also this discussion with these monuments, for example. Who decides how our public space, we share it, how the space looks like? Usually, it's not Black people, it's not people of color, and usually the backlash is, oh, you do identity politics. I mean, if your identity really matches an ugly monument like this, that's very sad.
Emilia thinks the debate is very interesting. Brandon said he's tired of it, he's bored by it all. Let's get Emilia, first of all, the statues, the monuments debate. Tell us where you're coming from there. You know,
well, I think it's symbolically, it's very powerful because we see that it's happening everywhere in the world. And so I'm coming back again to my idea of the idea of a collective epiphany, knowing that we want to, so I think it's Webb Dubois who said this, we want to lift the veil of it could be called of silence, you know, or the veil of skewed history. And the images, for me, are really powerful in the sense that it questions power. And it questions the invisible, objective, neutral norm that is supposed to represent history and science. And in that sense, it's raising a lot of voices, so many different perspectives, and telling one side of history. And so there's an African proverb that says, until the lion can tell the story of the hunt, only the hunter will be glorified. And this is exactly what's happening. So that's why by tearing down those statues, we're setting the record of history right, in the sense that we allow another perspective on history to be shed, and we also pay tribute and respect to the victims and survivors of slavery, of the genocides that have been committed against the Nama and Herero here in Germany. So few people know about that, for example. And so that's why I think it's powerful and really long overdue.
So this is a very passionate take on that debate. You did say while we were listening to the report that you found the debate to become tiresome.
Well, what white people really hate is taking away their individualism. And when you generalize about white people, you become very defensive. The fact is that white people have to decide to reflect internally and stop focusing on the externalization of racism. I grew up in the South, lots of Confederate flags, lots of statues about slavery. I know how people think and how they really feel about racism. Taking statues down is not going to change the racial conscience of white Americans. It's beautiful, it's passionate, but in the long run, it's not going to change much.
But don't you think that we need to have like change happening from very different angles, and that it's organic, and that, you know, having this can help as well trigger change on another front?
Many white people in America don't like the look and the feel of racism, but putting steps in place to give cultural access and cultural membership to people of color, especially musicians like I'm coming from, they're not willing to do it. Tearing down a statue feels good, it makes you look good, it empowers you. But what happens after you take down the statue? Are you going to hire Black people in the workplace? Are you going to get Black friends? 75% of all white people don't live around Black people, which makes the self-reporting of racism suspicious. And it's even more so in Germany. So it's wonderful, take them down, of course, but it's not going to change anything.
I was in Charlottesville in February, and they have the same discussion. And I had the feeling there it's a battleground, it's a proxy discussion for so much more. So I would argue it doesn't harm if this ugly-ass statue is gone, but also I would see both of you and agree that it does make a difference in the public space, but it does not change that so many Black people and people of color are living in the conditions.
Of course, I want to take down the people who owned my ancestors, but is it really going to change things? I'm not sure.
It's lifting the veil.
Yeah.
Well, more or less every fourth person here in Germany has roots outside the country, and sadly these Germans are often excluded. They're given a very hard time, in large measure because of how they look. One case in point in Corona times is the many Asian Germans who say that they are feeling the brunt of racism on a regular basis. Let's have a look.
Victoria Kure-Wu is German. Her parents came to Germany long before she was born. She's used to encountering prejudice because of her appearance. After the corona outbreak began in China and the first cases appeared in Germany, this bad treatment intensified. She's experienced degrading looks, and some people make a show of avoiding her. She said a man called out to her that she should be sprayed with disinfectant. I have the feeling that since the pandemic began, I should go more hesitantly through the streets. I make myself small and I'm afraid of encountering hostility. I also have the feeling that even though I live in Berlin, I'm just not perceived as German. Integration researcher Nao Ha isn't surprised by this at all. The question, where are you from? I can have German citizenship, I can have a German passport, and still be confronted with these questions just because I don't look German. What does it mean to look German? Being stigmatized because of a different skin color or a non-German ethnic background. How do we solve our racism problem?
Mohamed, that one question there, what does it mean to look German, seems so very significant.
It does. But I'm glad that you brought this example, because during Corona, or when it started, a lot of people told me, oh, we are all the same now, because the virus does not see any color.
We're all in it together.
It's not like that. Intersectionally, we can see that different groups in society are hit in a different way by this virus. Yeah. I came from the US to Germany, and a lot of my friends in the US, they said, at least you have healthcare there. No, it's not that easy, because if you are undocumented, for example, or you have refugee status, you cannot just go to the hospital. And it's like just shocking that Corona is just showing the structures we are living in here in Germany. And if you do not look like a typical German, which is white, then you have often a problem.
OK, so you very eloquently, once again, outlined the problem that we are faced with. How do we move forward from here? And before we came in, we were chatting together before the programme, and you were saying the only people who can change all this are the whites.
Yes. Well, I just want to say after this that I believe integration and assimilation is not the answer. Yes. I think we need to have what I call naked acceptance, because integration, assimilation means to become imitation white German. Yeah. And this is one of the most difficult things about Germany, is to accept people that don't fit this particular image. And as Germany becomes globalized, it's just creating more and more problems. But yes, this is a problem that white people can decide to solve. This is not something you can do with money. You can't do through legislature. It's something that white people have to develop the conscience to reflect on.
Emilia, what do you think the white community can contribute to all this? Well,
first of all, you mentioned that white people react very defensively when we take away their privilege of individualism, which is a white privilege, by the way, because, a lot of people of color and black people don't have the privilege to just act and speak for themselves. Like anything we say here will going to be inferred to our entire ethnic groups and race. So I think what's important is to confront this fragility, the fact that when we speak about racism, white people get defensive because they feel attacked personally and they don't want to be seen as a bad person. It's not what it is about. We're tackling a system that has been in favor of white people, and that's the responsibility of white people to see this and to detach their ego from the whole conversation. And that's the only way we can move forward to develop empathy, as you were also saying. I think it's really important that dominant groups learn to feel empathy towards minorities, and that's something that we learn from very early on. Little boys, little girls learn from the early childhood to identify and feel empathy towards boys. Non-white people learn to feel empathy and to identify with white people. Why? Because they are so dominant in the media, in stories, in films, in television, advertisements, etc. And so that's why there's an imbalance of power and privilege that needs to be turned around and reshuffled. We need to really find power in that sense. And this can only be done if there's a readiness to put whiteness in question and to render it visible, to say whiteness is the fundament of, or white supremacy is the fundament of racism. So what do we do with it? How do we deconstruct the white superior norm? And that's what needs to be done.
That's amazing
that's where we
what
need
you
to
said.
start.
Thank you so much for that.
You have half a minute on how to overcome, white people like me, how can I overcome my own racism?
I think I need more than a half a minute for that. But what I always say is, yes, in the US you have got Donald Trump, but the discussion is 20 years ahead compared to the discussion here in Germany. We don't even have a language to talk about racism in Germany.
That
so this is why I'm glad to.
That's a very important point.
to
Okay,
listen
guys,
to
thank you. I'm sorry, I've got the time is too short. I hope we have given you some food for thought on what is a very, very difficult matter, a very difficult debate. 3 excellent guests. Thank you all for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Thank you.